Cool. Well, hello and welcome to Virtual DDD, the home of domain-driven design online. Today we have the amazing Dr. Kat Hicks, who's going to be talking to us about the innovation of cumulative cultures and developer problem solving. As you can see on the screen, Virtual DDD has a Discord channel. Please feel free to join us so that we can continue the conversation there. And also this talk relates to this paper. So if you want to read about it, the whole thing later, please feel free to join it. Kat, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself and take on the reins, please?
Absolutely. I will jump in and I will start a screen share. So let's make sure that is all set. I see one note that they can't see the screen share. Can folks see this the most
Yeah, we
slide?
can see it.
Wonderful. All right, folks. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Kat Hicks, and I am a PhD in psychology. I do a whole bunch of things around the internet. You can see a lot of my work summarized on my website at Dr. Kat Hicks. I am a VP of research. I also have founded a couple of things. So, one of the things that often brings people to my space is that I founded the Developer Success Lab. That is a lab which is at Pluralsight, where I'm also the VP of research. And what we focus on with the Developer Success Lab is doing empirical research for developers, about developers, and it's open access research. It's kind of, I've called it an open science project. We do a whole bunch of things. You'll hear a little bit of a highlight in this talk of some of those things, but there's a lot more material online for you should you wish it, as we're always trying to get our research materials out there. I also wanted to start this talk by just telling you I have had a very, very hard week. Um, and I'm coming to you with insomnia, sleep deprivation. My beautiful little dog was actually attacked last weekend. He's doing okay now. But I just thought I would tell you because this talk is about being human together. It's about how we solve problems together. And these are some of the real problems that I'm solving and feeling right now. So I preemptively appreciate your grace, your patience if I stumble over words, if the slides are a little weird, because we were dealing with a lot. And actually, in this moment when this really hard event happened for my family, I had this cognitive experience that later, as a psychologist, I found really interesting. And it was being in the car on the way to pick up my dog, and my wife gave me a task: find an emergency hospital to go to. I opened up my phone and I opened up Google Maps, and my mind went completely blank. I had absolutely no idea what to put in, what text to put in. I had thoughts rushing through my head like, what if pet hospitals are bad? What if some of them are scams? I felt like I didn't have contextual information. And in this moment, the thing that occurred to me to do was to call a really good friend of ours. So I did that. I just went over to my contacts. I called my friend who had a dog, who I knew had been through some medical issues with their dog. And I said, what should I do next? Where should I take this being that I love so much? And he gave me the answer. This to me was a moment of cumulative culture coming in to do collective problem solving. It's not that I'm incapable of making these decisions or finding a hospital or being that source of support for somebody else. I'm very capable of that. I'm usually the person in our family who books hotel rooms, who decides what businesses we go to, and makes all kinds of executive decisions like this. However, in that moment, my resources were so taken by so many other functions, and I'm sure all of us have kind of had this sort of experience before. So I thought that would be kind of an interesting way to start this talk. And I have a second interesting way to start this talk, and um, that is by telling you a little bit about this cumulative culture theory that I started working on. As Andrea already mentioned, we have a paper on this project. It was co-authored with Anna Havesi, who is also a consultant with Uploop. And I have just adored working on this story and this model for the last year. So I'm really excited to talk to you in particular about it. You can find this paper at this QR code. I will also post, I have a ton of links. I love to cite things. So I will post all of my references, links, materials in a blog post after this talk. You do not have to stress about taking notes or following them on your phone if you don't like QR codes, which I know some people don't. All right, second fun way to introduce this talk, I'm going to actually do a different screen sharing. Let's see if we get this to work. What I'm going to show you is a different moment of problem solving. All right, so you should be able to see this video. It should be a still image right now. You see this video? Great. All right. So take a look at this little guy. This is a New Caledonian crow. And what is happening here is there's food inside of this tube, and this food is inside of a little bucket, and he has a little wire. So he's trying to get the food with a wire. Wire is an ineffective tool, and so what the crow is doing right now is fashioning this tool into a hook to make it an actual tool for this problem. Now, we all know we don't get it right the first time. It takes a little bit of iteration, right? Shaping a little hook here, using the affordances around him. And boom, there's the bucket with the food in it. All right, awesome. I'm so glad that worked. It's so wonderful to see videos of these things. So why are we looking at crows? What's interesting about this? Crows are actually very, very interesting to researchers who think about problem solving. The video that I showed you was from the Behavioral Ecology Research Group, University of Oxford. It's actually a really famous research study, and there have been a lot of other research studies. So if now you're just in the mood to watch birds do problem solving, I have more videos for you. There's a whole bank of videos associated with this paper. Rooks are also quite good at problem solving. So crows, rooks, a whole number of different animals here. And this is really interesting to me as someone who loves human problem solving, because it's a whole series of research that tells us about the kind of creative, novel solution generation that these beings are capable of. So these animals that we share the planet with, they are capable of coming upon strange problems, strange things they have to solve, and then fashioning new solutions. This is essentially a very basic form of innovation. So what did scientists do next? You know, scientists, we love to ask more questions. So we decided we were going to give that same problem to children. So that same problem you saw, I think in the case of children, it was a toy or something like that, but it was in a tube and you had a wire and you had to bend the wire into a hook. We showed it to a bunch of children. And guess what? The children are actually terrible at solving this problem. As long as they're under the age of about 7, 5 to 7, something like that, children really reliably fail. Actually, I think even older than that, children fail to generate novel solutions or build novel tools in this context. But if you have children, you know they interact with novel objects all of the time. And so one next step that researchers took here is they had a researcher bend the wire in front of children. What happened in that situation? The children were actually quite extraordinary. They essentially went from failing almost all of the time at getting the toy to succeeding almost all of the time. The next thing that children were really extraordinary at doing was modeling that solution for other children. So you can create kind of a little problem-solving chain of toddlers here. You know, doing psychology is really fun research because you get to do things like this. And children can quite reliably take on the solution, remember it, show it to other children, and then even adapt it to new contexts. So this is something that developmental psychologists think that we are quite amazingly good at. We are great imitators. But we have kind of this paradox in our early cognitive development. So how is it that we have this incredible technology, right, that traverses the globe, but at the same time, it seems like we're kind of slow to evolve it. We're kind of slow to develop it across our lifespan. And this is a reframe that I want to propose to this audience because having worked for quite a while with technology teams, quite a while in software now, I realize a lot of us love to think about the part of our minds that is creative and to think of ourselves maybe as like solitary tinkerers, who like to kind of generate constant solutions. I have a reframe for you, which is that we are really good imitative learners. And I want us to kind of just sit with this for the rest of this talk and kind of figure out how to respect it a little bit more because I think it's actually incredibly useful and beneficial when we're trying to make our software teams perform better or just feel happier. So, to kind of summarize what I've been saying, we are going to live for this talk in the land of problem solving. And problem solving is complicated. It contains many different possible components. So for instance, as you interact with the world around you and you want to do things like have fun in the water, like this beautiful parrot, you might have to generate totally novel solutions, things that have never been seen before, right? But you might also have to apply old solutions to new problems. So that is a perfectly valid form of problem solving in psychology. We also think of problem solving as something like composing. You have this vocabulary maybe of lots of different solutions you know about, and then you also have diverse different abilities you harness. You can foreground some of them and background other ones, right? Where these kind of diverse creatures with these diverse minds. And then another way you can describe problem solving is in terms of its goal orientation. So, what are we trying to do? The very bare bones kind of foundation of problem solving starts with having a goal in the first place. So, there's maybe a piece of problem solving that includes deciding what your goal is, adapting to a new goal over time, or adapting your solutions because the goals are changing. This whole component is also something that we can think about. From this rich body of psychological science, and again, I'll give you these citations, but I really like this area because we've actually gone all over the world with it to many, many different cultures to study this kind of evolution. This quote from a paper that was really fun to read about innovation and the development of innovation, they give this really simple premise for why we are so good at imitation. Novel objects in the form of artifacts and tools saturate our world, and we must understand and use an enormous array of them from a very early age. When I read this, it's kind of funny to read things that are written to be about toddlers, but then think, I can really use this with my software teams, right? Like who among us does not relate to this feeling of being in a world that's saturated with novel objects, things other people created, right? And that we have this array we're interacting with. I love the richness of this. Now, again, all of this might feel a little strange if you're really used to kind of assuming that the most valuable thing a developer's mind does is write code. It is fascinating and helpful to me to realize that in the core architecture of our problem solving, as best we can tell, we start with things like a collaborative, strategic dialogue with elements of our environment that we did not create ourselves. So again, this is a reframe from solitary tinkerer to a social imitative learner, someone who is really good at that piece. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you like parties, that you have incredible social skills, or all of the kind of things that we usually load into that word social, right? What I mean by this is really that we are constantly engaging with this kind of collaborative cognitive architecture. All right. So researchers have packaged up this whole interesting set of findings into some theories. And one of the theories that I explore in the paper I told you about in the beginning of this talk is the theory of cumulative cultures. In a quote from Christine Laguerre, who studies this quite exhaustively, she writes, humans live in culturally constructed niches. These niches are filled with artifacts, skills, beliefs, and practices that have been inherited, accumulated, and modified over generations. Again, kind of sounded like software to me. I've actually had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Laguerre on a podcast, And we have a lovely conversation over there about culture, stepping out of the silo. I've linked that here for you. And I want us to take a beat here and again sit with this frame of a social learner, an imitation learner, and think about it from the point of view of a software developer. A lot of conversations that I have with executives start with something like, I want my developers to do more X or less Y, like a lot of top down kind of, how do we get them to do this? And I find it's a very helpful conversation starter or arrestor, really. It's actually a conversation stopper, but it's a good stop if you need it to happen. To say something like, can we just describe a typical day for a software developer in this organization? Let's do it. So really right now, let's take a little beat and imagine like what's a typical day. And I mean, if you're not a software developer, something else fits. Think about a typical day for you. And I would prompt it a little bit like this. Think about, what are the tasks? What part of your cognition are you using? And you can feel free to throw some things in the chat. I can't promise that I'm going to be able to see it, but okay, I found a way to make it open. A typical day? Okay, yeah, that's a fair call out from David. Is there a typical day? So, all right, a typical day is diverse, unexpected, surprising, can't be predicted. Fixing other people's random bugs under pressure. Okay. Fighting chaos, more unpredictability, more variability. I think about tasks like documentation, remembering what happened yesterday, syncing with a colleague to make sure your memory was accurate because you started to get the sense that maybe you missed something, doing some design work. Ooh, bosses redirecting my energy constantly to new problems they haven't solved. So there's some social need, not in the sense of, again, liking social stuff, but in the sense of having to need your cognition to think about other people and what they want and their motivations. Thinking before sharing work. So I'm seeing some metacognition, what we call metacognition in psychology, like a lot of self-regulation, develop features based on requirements from stakeholders and ship. All right. Tight description of what people want your day to be, probably. Making mental models. Oh, I like that. Making mental models of problems. Investigating why it's not working. So maybe that requires something from your cognition, like triage, like cognitive flexibility, like creativity. All right, so I'm going to carry on with my talk because we could probably spend all day with this. But what I like to say about this is even just in one single workday, progressing software development probably requires the completion of many complex cognitive tasks. So developer problem solving has to recruit a lot of mechanisms. Those mechanisms might look like inhibition, they might look like your working memory, they might look like your attentional control, what we tend to call the executive functions. But there's a lot of other stuff happening. Planning, social learning, causal reasoning, right? Our problem solving is extremely multifaceted. I don't think that anything that I list is ever like the exhaustive final list. We have this thing that I sometimes call like factor fixation in software, where we like to kind of say, this is the list of factors and these are all the things that matter. Psychology doesn't really like that approach. We like to think about many, many multi-dimensional things. I think that, we often think software development problem solving, where does it happen? It must happen when people are writing code. I take a much, much broader approach. Software development problem solving is happening during conversations. It's happening during, as this comment says, meetings, 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 meetings. Maybe it's not the problem solving you want to be doing, but it's probably happening there. All right. So with this kind of big bank of problem solving and my fascination with it, I moved into doing software research, and I really stubbed my toe very hard on this thing that kept happening to me, which is that everyone constantly wants to ask me about 10x developers all the time. And I kept asking myself, what is this idea? This might sound hopelessly naive to you all, but as someone who had come up in assessment science, in psychology research, where we had been curious about things like social learning and performance, the metacognitive skills that people had, this idea that there would just be like a fixed, constant attribute of some individuals that would always make them consistently over deliver at this rate that's, really quite detectable compared to all other people. The first thing that I thought to myself was that's pretty wild. And if that exists, it should be really obvious. I've never seen a situation like that, but in tracing this idea back, and folks here might, have a lot of familiarity with this, so I'll kind of skim over this, but this was my detective journey with this that I went on while I was writing our cumulative culture paper. I went back to 1968. In 1968, a few things were happening in the world, just a few. Most households in America didn't have a computer. At universities like Yale University, there was a really seismic debate happening. So leadership was having public debates, and also very cool, there were secret, covert meetings that some groups on this campus were having. And the question that these people were all debating in 1968 was, should Yale admit women? All right. So 1968 is also the year during which a really important Civil Rights Act passes. And I mention all of this just to give you a little bit of sort of feeling of context. Like, listen, this is not necessarily the year in which the human species has done its best work at identifying human potential. Nevertheless, this is the year in which a paper was published, a pretty unassuming case study, and it's published in the communications of the ACM, and it has a really prescient opening salvo. I'm showing you a screenshot from this PDF, which I dig up all the time to make sure I remember the details correctly. The quote in this paper that I wanted to read to you is not on this page, sorry, that's distracting, but the quote is, "The human costs of computer programming continue to rise and one day will probably greatly exceed hardware costs." So this is relatively famous if you're kind of a nerd about older papers in computer science like I am, because it's really laying out this opening salvo of like, we better start understanding these developers because they're probably going to be expensive. So that feels kind of familiar if you've lived through the last few years of layoffs, right? And I want to tell you a little bit more about this old paper. So it's a really small design. It's an odd design, kind of understandable for the day, but they're giving people these math-based problems, measuring how quickly those problems are solved and comparing them. And there's some stuff about how they solve the problems that we won't go into, and maybe you all get angry about that because you want to know the technical details, but I'm interested in the psychological details of this. And it's a very small group, right? 12 people. One of the things that is represented in this paper is this idea of individual differences in how quickly, essentially, just the hours that it took to get through these tasks. And then we look at the differences between individuals. So we essentially are stack ranking developers at this time in this paper. And the authors of this paper take what I think is a pretty extreme stance towards the end of it, where they say, we have some evidence here for massive individual differences. There's kind of a cheeky limerick in this paper, which I think shows sort of like the style of papers of the time. But they say, there's an order of magnitude difference for performance variables. Notice that we have moved from saying these are just timing measures, which is what they are, to saying these are performance variables. And this, to me, was one of the origins of the 10x developer idea, these individual differences as measured by a difference in the time of a task for 12 people. This got life, I think, because it's used in this book, The Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks, which is quite well known. If you don't know it, however, that's totally fine. I didn't know it when I came into this field. So known by the people around us, let's say. I never try to gatekeep on these things. So he uses this study, but doesn't really talk about the details of it, but uses it quite forcefully in his chapter, The Surgical Team. Now, this is not like a Fred Brooks bashing, talk or something like this. However, I will put it out there that I just find this egregious. So he writes things like let's do this thought experiment that, there's this 10-to-1 productivity measurement difference. Again, we've drifted entirely from saying this is just about time and even what the task is in the first place, whether the task is relevant for the future task we're concerned with. But let's just take this ratio as kind of a constant, right? Again, I cannot emphasize enough that this is an extremely weird, small case study. And it's also nothing like software development today. Nevertheless, this claim has extraordinary life. Some things that I think about when I see claims like this and when I trace this back are the problems I have with taking a task like this and saying we know something about individual aptitude because of it. So, in assessment science and psychology, we think about a number of things. And if someone's coming at you with arguments about 10x developers and you want to sound like Cat on this, these are the things that I would say. Um, I would say that we have big problems with the construct validity of this. Does this task measure what we're saying it measures, like productivity? Time on task, psychologists have known for a long time, is not a direct measure of effort. You can take the same amount of time and be working really hard, and you could take the same amount of time and be working really slow. We don't know enough, or working really without much effort. I mean, we don't know a lot about what we're measuring if all we have is raw time. It's also not a measure of productivity, which is actually a very multidimensional concept in psychology. And is it ecologically valid? That means for the moment that we're in, does this even translate? Making a claim that there are robust, chronic individual differences between people, that is something that humanity has been interested in for a very long time and consistently screws up. So, making a claim that there are these differences, that's a really big claim. It tends to be sticky. It tends to have a big impact on people's lives. It might change who gets hired. It might change how people are evaluated. I think you need big evidence for this kind of claim. I also think it's pretty remarkable that you can kind of take one moment of developing a task that probably somebody sat down for an afternoon and developed and said, this is going to be like a good lab task for a developer. That's interesting. But are we learning about the task that we've just designed, or are we learning about some quality of programmer aptitude or programmer ability? There's just a lot of leaping forward past all of the methodological steps that I would want to see in this kind of thing. And finally, kind of the damning, the death toll for me for this paper is there's really no curiosity here about whether an individual person is extremely variant in their own time. So forget the whole thing about comparing people and just ask, do people consistently obtain the same result when they solve this task over and over again? The answer, even in this small case study, is actually no. I'm not the only person who has critiqued this paper. Here's one of the citations for someone who did. I also think, there's something great that Mar Hicks wrote in Your Computer is on Fire, their chapter there, that there was a big thing happening in the 1960s for computer work. And that was the transition away from women computers and towards a male dominated career. So a quote from that chapter is, the complexity of the work did not suddenly change, but the perception of its worth skyrocketed. It is never explained in this original 1968 paper whether the participants, what gender they have. However, they talk about man hours, and obviously the Brooks book talks about a man month, so to me, the story is pretty clear. I would also propose to you that a lot of the time we have cared more about designing really good, high quality tasks to study crows than we have to study modern developers' problem solving. And I kind of just want to ask, like, what gives? You know? Don't developers deserve better studies of their problem solving? I want to propose to the folks in this community and just kind of the broader industry around me right now, we can be a little bit braver about looking some of these old stories in the face. I don't think we have to tiptoe around this and treat it like it's really great evidence. All right. So, what are some ways to move forward? I came up with this extremely simple way of describing what I think is the working model that I often encounter when I'm consulting with software teams, when I'm trying to lead projects that do behavior change for software teams or help people working on developer experience advocate for changes. A lot of people, and let's set aside who, maybe it's executives or pick your favorite kind of bad guy here. But a lot of people have this very simplistic model, right? Here is a developer in the center. I apologize, this is my terrible Google Slides person that I made. And this person is taking in tasks, right? They're coming in this sort of linear journey. This person has something going on inside of them. Maybe it's like a magic engineer trait that makes them better or worse. Maybe it's working memory, right? A lot of people like to talk about that one. There's some kind of thing going on in the environment outside. And let's say cognitive load, because I hear people talk about the concept of cognitive load a lot. So maybe your cognitive load is in the green, it's okay sometimes, maybe you get overloaded, that affects your ability to exercise your magic inner engineer trait, right? And what comes out of this combinatorial interaction is magical code, which is obviously the only thing that matters. Okay, so I want to take apart a few pieces of this picture from the point of view of psychological science. And I'm going to get rid of the whole part of it that everyone likes to fight about the most, the task and the code. I don't care about the task and the code right now, all right? This is a huge heresy that I like to engage in, which is that I don't care that much about your code. I pretty much care about the person at the center and trust you all to write the code that we need. Okay, so let's examine this idea first that people have that maybe there's kind of this really simple little cognitive switch that we can do to improve people's problem solving. And I'm going to use cognitive load as an example. Sometimes it's other pieces of the whole cognitive picture, but this is a really popular one. And cognitive load came from folks like Sweller in education design, came from this idea that, people are handling a lot of extraneous information sometimes. We want to make the information they have to process in the moment, germane to the problem at hand. Not a bad insight. However, there are some real problems with thinking this is the only thing happening for developers. Some of my issues with using cognitive load that I explore in our paper, cognitive load is not the same thing as stress. It's also not the same thing as what's germane to the problem or not. That's not an easy question to answer, actually. Sweller himself wrote a meta-analysis about how cognitive load has been used ever since the theory was sort of first put out there. And this meta-analysis has some interesting choice pieces in it where they say, we don't really know like who needs to deal with stress in their real working conditions all of the time. Like we don't know what's going to be germane. And that makes this knowing what to do with cognitive load very complicated. I also don't like this model for what's happening for developers because I think it really targets the attentional system. Now, the attentional system is a thing that matters in a lot of complex ways, but I think that a problem I have is that people have very diverse attentional systems. I have my wonderful little brother has profound ADHD, has a lot of different strategies for managing having a very different attentional system than many other people. And that does not make him a less worthy problem solver, right? So if we start to set up these models that say, oh my gosh, there's one executive functioning and that's everything, that's it, that's more essential than the others, we can do a lot of unintentional discriminatory gatekeeping around problem solving that don't match the real world because we actually have many higher order workarounds when we study this thing. So respecting that's very important. I think also incredibly important for developers as a group of people. I see many diverse minds in this field doing incredibly different and cool kinds of strategies. I like to celebrate all of that. Also, cognitive load, executive functions, all of these arguments, these are really hard to change, all right? So if you're out there trying to say, this is what orgs should change, I would like the first follow-up question to be, how? How are you going to increase people's cognitive load capacity? If the answer is, we're going to make our planning better, great. What you're doing is reducing stress or improving clarity or taking away some social issue, right? But I think you're dancing around what the real issue is, which is probably an organizational factor, and making it a cognitive factor that's just stuck between two people, what's happening in between someone's ears. that's just blaming the individual, right? Also, the executive functions, they're really interesting. We have a lot of research on them. They don't tend to predict everything we want to predict about achievement outcomes over a long time. So you should never feel like you are being handed some kind of destiny if you show up a little bit differently on a distribution with one of these executive functions, all right? And that's why I like to start this talk by saying, let's think about how complex all the things we have to do in the day are, and you can start to feel a little, I feel at least, a little sense of rest and peace in that diversity. All right. I have a huge number of problems with the magic engineer trait part of this that we won't go into, but I just want to point out, if you're going to say we can fix everything by changing cognitive load, what you're saying is that the biggest thing that matters to the software development problems that we need to solve is working memory, essentially. There are a few things not captured by somebody's working memory. Their long-term planning won't be there, their communication, their creativity, the idea of causal reasoning, that the way their causal reasoning is working. And there's a really big one for me, which is performance on small cognitive tasks that we develop to measure things like cognitive load. They often change. How well someone performs changes a great deal if you set them up to succeed at the things that they have trained their mind to be good at. This is something that we call ecological validity in psychology. Again, I think I used that word before. And this has to do with the idea of domain specific cognition. So if you're just hearing stories from like 1980s or 1960s cognitive science, you may not be aware of this. So like, let me blast it into your minds. Cognition's really hard to measure. And for a long time, we would do things like, this is psychology's fault, very biased history that we have here. We have brought, children into the lab, given them a working memory task, and said things like, okay, well, children who grew up with adversity and who are lower income, they don't have as good executive functionings. They have a deficit there. Well, really exciting, and I think very admirable, brave, cool, cutting edge work in CogSci has directly challenged this. So they developed more cognitive tasks that situated those problems in the areas that those children would have had to solve in their actual lives. So still executive functioning tasks, but make it a social task, or put it in kind of the practical landscape that those children have to navigate. Also, cultural sensitivity was a big piece of this work. When you do that, the deficit strength gap has actually reversed for large numbers of these populations. In these domain specific areas, children who grow up with adversity have really unique cognitive strengths. So this is the new paradigm in CogSci, and I say don't let anybody tell you differently. All right. Just to further drive the point home, I have made the ugliest chart in the world for you to enjoy. So we're going to try to trouble this chart. And I showed you a very, very simple model of the kind of problem-solving process that I think a lot of people are carrying around. I'm going to show you another model and make the point, too, that this is still a model. Like, all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. So here's the model that I find more useful than that simplistic one. We start with this developer, and this developer is a complex self. So they have cognition, they also have metacognition, they have a great deal of different kinds of skills that we might be interested in. They have the sociocognitive, things like motivation, things like their sense of belonging, right? But it's important to see this person as multi-systems already. And then we know we don't have one task coming at us, right? We have like a strange flurry, like a flock of tasks that come at us, right? There's the thing that somebody asks you to do in the day, but then there's also the things that are buried inside of those other things. And some of those tasks are bigger than other tasks, and some of them have subcomponents that are other tasks, right? This is like being a working professional in the complicated real world, all right? So the other thing that I want to draw your attention to is I've made a whole bunch of dashboards. So let's blow up this idea of like a single executive function and say instead we have many, many, many capacities, right? And some of these capacities, it's good to be high on them, like sleep. And if you're low on sleep, you're probably not solving problems super great that day. but some of them get a little bit wild. So, for instance, maybe exercise, super great for your problem solving. Too much exercise, however, is terrible for your problem solving because you'll be exhausted. And there are things that are like dialectically true. Sometimes they help you because they interact with another thing. A good example of a complex relationship here might be something like a developer's inhibitory control. So it's really great to be able to focus down, to inhibit, to narrow your focus, right? And you might be extremely good at grinding if you do that. And there might be situations where that grinding is showing up in terms of short term performance gains. However, what gets by definition cut out when you're really foregrounding that inhibitory control is creativity and divergent thinking and mind wandering. Mind wandering is actually an extremely important cognitive function. People get more creative when they mind wander. I would also probably speculate, haven't been able to measure this. I'd love to do a creativity study. But I think that developers often need to get jolted out of the problem they're solving because they have noticed something, because they're distracted by something, because there's like friction, because there's something that feels like an odd edge case, but actually turns out to be really critical to a different causal connection. If we try to smooth out all of the problem solving and never let that happen, we'll be cutting away important exploration. All right. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of output that we won't even have time to go into, but I would dispute, I'm sure all of you would dispute, that the only thing a developer is ever thinking about outputting is magical code. There's all kinds of other things you might need to output, and those are also cognitive tasks that require problem solving. So maybe you need to have communication, you need to do problem solving around translating the goals of the org into what you're doing. You have your own goals, you have the goals of users. I just threw a bunch of sort of things on here to remind us how complicated the picture is. Okay, just take a breath because I've been talking so fast. I get really excited about these ideas. And I'm going to show you a much simpler picture. This is our paper in a meme. I like to challenge myself to try to just explain what I'm doing in my scientific work in a single image. And I like this image in particular. I think it shows us that individual cognition explanations for the kind of innovation and problem solving we want, it's really easy to explode those explanations as long as you're willing to just look a little bit more closely at the picture. That was a lot of critique. So, what can we do instead of just critique? Well, one thing that I want to do, I want to name what I've been critiquing and say that I think that a lot of the time when we're talking about developer problem solving, we are doing cognitive cherry picking. All right? We're taking a small piece of evidence out of context and then we're really overgeneralizing about it. However, it is fascinating to try to learn about our minds. I don't begrudge anybody wanting to know how does my attention work? What is happening in my mind? What am I good at? What am I bad at? Those are like very natural human questions. But the second reframe that I'm going to propose to you is that we stop trying to do this cognitive cherry picking and we start talking a lot more about cognitive scaffolding. So I like to ask these kinds of questions in my work. What is it that can help an individual developer access their full range of ability? And also, what is it that can help them more fluently move through what they need to foreground and background in that dynamic process of problem solving? We have a few hints. I'm going to share a few hints with you from Learning Science. This is some pretty classic work from Bob Bjork and colleagues. There's a whole lot more here. This is just one review that I think is helpful and a good read. I can send you others if you're curious about this. But a few things that we tend to recommend as learning scientists essentially focus on the idea of getting to a desirable difficulty. And that maximizes people's performance and in a sustainable way. So, what is a desirable difficulty? Well, our minds actually really benefit from challenge and really benefit from active learning. And this is also something that we tend to get wrong in the moment. So we often kind of avoid challenge or we choose more passive strategies, and those don't actually help our long-term achievement, learning, and retention. All right. So one example of this is called the generation effect. If you can stop yourself when you're learning something new, or you're maybe navigating a new code base, and find some task to do where you generate something, all right? And that might be diagramming, that could be flashcards, but essentially we find over and over again, actually, even in, it's a strong enough effect that it surprises scientists a lot of the time. Generating things is so good for us, and we problem solve better by capitalizing on this. All right. I'm sorry if this is so super, super basic, for this educated audience, but I tell people all the time, what is the biggest thing you can probably do to help your own problem solving? Reducing stress, honestly, reducing bad stress. And I know that that is, like eat your vegetables advice, but I truly believe in it. And if the cognitive load story, like if you kind of wince because it really, really, hits you when people talk about it, maybe it's because it's sort of naming this thing that I would describe as allostatic load. And that is the overall load that hits an individual from their life level stress. So that includes social factors, that includes discrimination, that includes, chronic stress, health. A lot of different things are packed into that concept. It might be the concept that you are looking for, and very righteously looking for validation from. All right, so whatever you can do to decrease that allostatic load, important stuff. The third tip I would give is just seeking out active learning. We really trick ourselves into thinking we are learning a lot by actively consuming. Sorry, passively consuming, excuse me. So you can get the feeling that you're learning, the feeling of progress by just bombarding yourself constantly with content. I think about like the scrolling TikTok feeling. I try to limit my passive consumption and increase my active learning, especially when I feel really burnt out or really fatigued. Because sometimes I'm burnt out of like being a consumer. I don't mean that you have to live this life like always leveling up or something like that. I actually think of it like mindful engagement is honestly what we're going for. And your mind really loves to have mindful engagement. So, what are some ways I see this showing up in my consulting with engineering orgs, in my research? I love to look at the strategies that I think developers are already using that I think benefit them. And when I'm consulting with an org and I ask, you know, is this a place that's protecting its cumulative cultures and allowing developers to access that? These are just some of the proxy signals that I look for. So, do developers get the chance to be active learners in a code base? That is a really interesting, productive question for me. An example of this is a developer described to me that he was always looking for little anchors in the code, and those were places that he really understood what was happening, like understood the cause and effect, and then had the opportunity to like build out from there, test for like a new foothold, like in rock climbing, right? And sitting around and doing this and being in a job where he got to spend, like a whole week just building his mental models and understanding of the code was something he reflected on as like one of the best jobs he ever had. So this might look a lot of different ways for people, but there's some quality of, do people really feel like, oh yes, absolutely, I am supported to build my understanding here? Another thing that supercharges our problem solving is the ability to do what researchers have called mental time travel. So, mental time travel is really interesting, I think, in software because you think about things like optionality, resilience. I like to ask who is doing the most mental time travel in this organization. Is it your infrastructure team? I've been thinking a lot about infrastructure right now. Are they being listened to? There's also a quality of whether future thinking or mental time travel is able to be shared across the organization. So researchers talk about, we can stash solutions that we don't yet have a problem for. I love this idea. I think it's so clever and cool. Like, mRNA vaccines technology might be an example of this, right? A lot of science works this way, where someone hits upon a really interesting connection, solution, issue, they can kind of see the shape of it, but they can't capitalize on it. And we pass these on across generations, right? This is a really big piece of cumulative innovation. if I like to look at signals like, do we see this generation effect happening at scale in an engineering org? So are developers constantly taking the time to do things like actively generate explanations for others? Again, I'll remind that, this social stuff doesn't have to mean liking being next to people or wanting to go to a party. So I would think that the generation effect would also work if you're just rubber ducking, right? You can kind of take advantage of your mind as a social learner, even when you don't really have someone to talk to that day. But this is a great activity to watch for. And finally, I think this is a really big one for us. Do developers get an exposure to diverse solutions? And this is something I use to argue for the value, the importance of trying things that don't work, and also like not punishing people for trying a whole bunch of different things, some of those things not working. We know from really extensive research, it's great for the solution space of a collective group if there are diverse solutions. And then some of those solutions essentially live over time and evolve. You can model this if you have a good enough data set, which is awesome. And then they get refined, and the next generation of kind of problem solving gets to start at a different place. But that diversity is really important. Sort of think of it like the collective intelligence that's spread out over people. So the more I think, again, we are getting stuck in the individual and what's between a single person's two ears and what's happening for them, the more we are cutting ourselves off from modeling and thinking of our organizations as like really living and breathing cultures. All right. I think that I am pretty much up on the time for this talk. I actually made way too many slides. So I'm going to throw up like my last slide, and then we can take a beat for questions. Thank you for your patience with this like crazy weekend that I had. All right, here's my last slide. I appreciate your time. I appreciate this chance to get to talk about these issues. I think it's really fascinating. I love thinking about how we can understand devs problem solving. And I have this final question for you, which is, listen, are we taking care of and protecting our cumulative cultures? I would love if every person here would just take a moment after this talk and ask themselves, is there a culture around software, around tech, that has really mattered to me? And do I think that that culture is like living, thriving, or is it being hurt, crushed? Is there something I can do to help this culture? A couple of places you can find me. I'm at drcathicks.com. I also am on a podcast called Change Technically. I'm pretty active on social media as Grimalkina. And next year I'll have a book called The Psychology of Software Teams, which I'm incredibly excited about. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you.
Wow, that was absolutely mind-blowingly good.
Thank
This was so exciting, and I don't know if you were looking at the comments in the chat, but I think a lot of us have our mind blown from how our mental models have updated. I'm sure there would be so many questions. Um, I know I have quite a few, and I was wondering. Um, you start off with the thing of cumulative cultures. Can you give us a working definition of culture, just to kind of kick this off in a nice,
you.
easy way?
Yeah, for sure. People have tried. I think that quote from Christine Laguerre is a really nice. Let me scroll back to it. We live in these collective groups, and those groups carry practices. And I think she describes it sometimes as like the grammar that we use. And so that grammar it's complex. I know this is a complexity group, so like no surprise. You can understand an expansive definition, but it includes skills, but it also includes belief systems, rituals. So we engage in rituals. An example also from Christine Laguerre that I really like is if I was giving this talk in person and we were all coming into the auditorium, we would all know how to file in probably and like take a seat. And that's cultural. And there are cultures that do it differently, right? And that's why I think it's so beautifully mind-blowing to like travel the world and start to you it's almost like you can only see your culture once, you see a difference from it, right? So I don't know that anybody who's not really arrogant would claim that they have a complete definition of culture. But yeah, it's that like comprehensive suite of behaviors that we're kind of expecting reinforcing. And people can be closer or further from their own culture, like in the way that they live and in the way that they act.
Thank you for that. And by the way, I do want to invite people to either send some questions in the chat. Also, first, I want to say thank you, Kat, and also thank you everyone for being here. I know you've been participating actively, so thank you very much. And yeah, does anyone have a question? If you want to like say it out loud, that's all right.
I'm like trying to, these are like rich comments. I'm like scrolling, but love it. I see a couple hands.
I also look forward to the book. Um, if you have a link to the book, that will be like,
Not yet, yeah. But my website is a good. You can like RSS my blog and I'll which I update not that frequently, but I update it with everything that's important to me. Like it'll be
okay, I
there.
see Sasha has a question and then Hazel has a question. Sasha, do you want to go?
Hi, Dr. Hicks. Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry for your terrible week, but I'm so grateful for your presentation. This is work that as you know, I find hugely valuable. And I'm thinking about the distinction of developers as a group. Uh,
Mm,
you know, a lot of this research focuses on development as a specific discipline. And looking, a lot of software work, of course, happens cross-disciplinary. There, on a team, there'll be designers, there'll be, testers, there'll be data scientists, etc.
mm.
And so, it, how much of this, this might not be an answerable question, but how much of this
Yeah,
is specific to development versus a cross-disciplinary effort?
yeah, for sure. So my head always explodes when this is such a lovely question. My head always explodes with like, oh my gosh, I want to be a product researcher now. Like I just have that reaction very deeply. Like there's so many kinds of knowledge work. I will posit though, there's some pretty hard, as in like hardened, like hardened security posture kind of thing, about developer as an identity, even in really cross-disciplinary teams. And I'm interested in that. So a lot of my stuff is specific to developers. But I think that we are all deeply impacted by kind of like what our reigning, I would say, unfortunately, reigning dominant US culture in this case says about what's technical and who is technical. And so I'm interested in that quite specifically. However, I think there's always kind of this leveling to it. So there's like core cognitive architecture and sociocognitive and the psychology. I think good psychology is essentially going to be generalizable in important ways. Otherwise, you're not talking about a human being, right? Like, but layered on top of it, there are field specific beliefs, field specific heritages, So I think there's really interesting stuff. Like, if I'm going to make myself a culture critic for a second about software development, it's a really interesting history that's going on here. There's a really interesting set of maybe warring cultures. I like to describe it. I know you know my other work quite well. Thank you for that. But like there's often tension between we are a learning culture, but not at work. We're a learning culture when we're all doing open source or whatever, or something we care about, but not over here, And so I think there's actually kind of really a war on, for like what is the culture of software dev. And I'm interested in that because I actually think it teaches us about there are other wars that are also on. So like in a field like biology, which has become much more computational. These computational pathways have opened up that have like started to diverge in the completely predictable ways. So like women are not going on the computational pathways. And I was just giving a talk at the Allen Institute, which is a fascinating organization, full of scientists. And those scientists have a bunch of really excellent data scientists, and the data scientists are coming in with their data science culture. And there is a big culture clash happening on teams like that. And so I think that, you know, without penalizing either side, it's quite clear to me that the scientists are struggling a lot of the time. And I think that shows that we have hierarchies as well. I think the software developer culture like wins because it has structural power in a lot of cases. People don't want to lose it. And then it starts to eat other cultures. So that's my Pac-Man theory about that. That
Awesome.
wasn't an answer, but yeah, more work to be done.
Hazel.
Hello, it was very lovely to watch you talk. So glad I got to be here for that. Thank you for getting distracted last minute, 10 minutes before this talk. We started chatting and I was like, wait, you have to talk. And anyway, so my question is, software has a very deep culture of shibboleth style knowledge and things that you know because you know, and mimetic knowledge sharing. And I remember actually going through and giving you like 200 links of random shit of, if you're a real software developer, you know this thing and you're like, wow. What were some of the more surprising memes or shibboleths that you encountered that explained some of the weird aspects of tech, or that was an aha moment of, this is why people are like this? Like,
Yeah. Oh man, what a great question. Thank you, Hazel. You know, I find the shibboleths and those artifacts like both like sometimes so beautiful and human and like sometimes so like disheartening, and you know, like it's a mix of all of those things. So this is so funny. What popped into my mind is I was just looking back at my email because I was looking for a silly meme that I made. And what I found was an email that I sent to my mom when I took my first tech job, which was at Google. And I discovered that Google has a big meme culture. I was not an online person. Like I didn't grow up with a lot of access to the internet or anything. So it was like very innocent, cute email that I sent to my mom, in my opinion, that was like, wow, people make such funny pictures about work and like it's so joyful. And that you know, was almost like my first little brush against software developer culture, because I had really come up with not with a, I didn't have that terminally online thing going on. So it was really unfamiliar to me, and it was really joyful to me and has kind of remained that. So maybe that's really surprising to you that it was surprising to me, but you know, I especially like had such a life of having to be very serious and like really academic and really like you couldn't ever joke in any way about work. I think the humor culture in software development is like fascinating. There's obviously like a hacker culture, you know, history there, but
the humor culture is so important, and one of the things that's so complicated about it is we use humor as both like a community building thing, as this camaraderie sort of thing, a coping mechanism, a trauma response, and a weapon. And we mix all of that in the same chat, sometimes even the same 5 minutes of, oh, I'm going to write a meme, and this meme is going to be used as a weapon against these people. I'm going to change this meme a little bit and go, oh, but we've all been in the trenches. We've all been in this, you know, horrible situation. Or this meme is, remember, you know, this horribly traumatic incident, and we're just going to joke about it and laugh it off. And then, but the same 5 minutes. And it's just so interesting how we use these. And I feel like it's almost, in a sense, a reaction of how developers communicate effectively. And I remember listening to one comedian talk about how, George Carlin actually, he mentioned that he was a comedian because if he wasn't a comedian, people would kill him for saying the things that he was saying. But if he was a comedian, if you make people laugh, you can tell them the truth. If you don't make them laugh, you can't tell them the truth. And he wanted to talk about the deeply systemic problems in society. You couldn't do that by just talking about it. you have to make fun of people, with people, about people, and then sort of accidentally get them to think about it. And I wonder if that's part of it.
Oh, for sure, I think it is. Or there's so many directions this could go, because there's a great paper that I saw not too long ago that was about like contempt in humor and like contemptuous humor as opposed to, like coalitional kind of community humor, and I think that that matches so many of the things you're describing, and some people are quite, you know, have an incredible skill, right, at doing that and kind of like opening people's minds. I think it's maybe a way to hear. I also like, just because I took this bold step in this talk, I'll mention gender too, because I mean, I think that there's really ways that humor is very gendered, and who gets to do it and how, and the history of the fields there, and obviously there's all sorts of other social identities, race as well, as a massive differences in humor. So yeah, too much to even have a single response, but I see a couple more hands here. I think
Yeah,
Brian.
yeah, Brian, yeah.
Hello. It's great to be here. Really wonderful to be able to listen to the talk. I want to take sort of a reverse question that Sasha had, which I think is interesting because I'm experiencing it firsthand too. So what do you think about, like, how do you think developer culture is influencing um new organizations as they are become led by developers who become
Yep.
founders, and how that influences the entire culture of the organization? And
Oh
how do we
man,
think about that as we work through those experiences?
I would almost throw this back to the community, because I'm actually really fascinated by this question. If you have like an in for me to do any kind of research here, I'd love that. But like, I see it just as a person in this field. Um, I think that's for sure happening, and it's very tied to me. It's very tied to different economic trends, and like I said, the structural power of what kind of developer are we talking about and what kind of company. And I think you're completely on, because there's this existing, again, this history and existing heritage and existing like, set of things people expect. And also, I think the signaling that some of these people feel that they have to do to show like, I'm a real developer, I'm an authentic whatever, I'm a techie, I'm not these whatever. There's a lot of like, and I'm not saying that with any like contempt. Like, I was briefly a startup founder and felt that I had to do that. Like, I felt that I had to do a lot of like, what's going to be my brands, what's going to be my beat, and especially already being a psychologist. Yeah, so it's like a big mess in my head as you were sort of saying that, but I would say it has tremendous economic force. Like, there's the idea of cultural capital. And I mean, developers, I see comments that are very true, that there's many other roles. There absolutely are. I think developers are fascinating to talk about specifically because of the ways their cultural power operates. And that doesn't mean they always think they have it. But I think they have a lot more than we sometimes acknowledge. I also think they have, certain kinds of decision-making power because of how close they are to certain kinds of decisions. So like, the whole world of technical tools is kind of grown up this ecosystem of different, people, and I sort of think of it like a jungle. It's not like it used to be 20 years ago, right? Where we didn't really have so many preconceptions about what you should look like if you're selling to developers. So yeah, I think culture's
As
deep
somebody
there.
currently selling to developers, but also
Yeah.
program managers, it's a very interesting thing because you're right. They're so
Yeah.
different. Um, and the other thing that I noticed that's really true is the expectation that everything can be done the same way that you can deal with code, which is
Mm.
like, here's this thing I need you to create. Here's a plan. Like, I want you to create a plan, marketing, sales, whatever it is. You should just be able to put that together, just write it down, and it'll be really good, you know. And like that, the there is a balance between how, and every single industry has been colonized by agile, right?
Mm.
Everything is agile marketing, everything is all of this, like it comes with sort of that change. And there are good things about that, but also sometimes I think it leads to a belief that somebody is just not doing the thing they need to do if it's not working as fast as like writing, changing the code and deploying and seeing how it worked.
It's hard when you feel like you're having an argument with the person who's not there, but who exists in the mind of the person you're arguing with, right?
Yes,
And like,
exactly.
who am I really talking to here? Like, what kind of game of telephone, is it you're just kind of saying this blog at me or something? Yeah, that's hard. That's really hard. And something I'm really curious about as a psychologist here is like, we all hold many identities. And some of these identities are obviously extremely structurally reinforced or have ties to, our body. Like I, have lung issues, and that's like a very physical reality for me. But there's also an identity, of someone who navigates the world a little differently. And it's interesting to me what identities people choose to kind of activate and where they choose to go. And I think that can be beautiful and important if you're kind of activating an identity that brings you into communion and solidarity, right? And so that can be something like we're all together working on this product. It doesn't matter, our different roles, but we're all different puzzle pieces. And that's like beautiful. Like we have a shared identity there. Or it can quickly splinter, right? And it can be like, well, I'm a developer and you're not, or I'm a product person and you're not. I'm very interested in what is it that causes teams to like tip in one direction or the other, because I think, there's a lot of human suffering there.
Cool. Well, I had another question for you, Kat, if you'll allow me. You talked a little bit about, you talked a lot about the person and how, um, the different things that as a person affect you on the whole cognitive load thing and the ecology, validity, and all of that. And that gives me some sort of idea of like, oh, I need to reframe this mental model a little bit to help me understand performance better. Because all of this kind of comes from the question of like cultures and the measuring performance. How we do it right now is just kind of, well, at least, to like we're just getting a sliver at best. At the same time, you mentioned power dynamics, and that's something I'm really really interested in, and I wonder how these two things kind of get together. So, how does one as an individual deal with the different types of power dynamics that different organizations present? And
Yeah.
and one that is quite common is the top-down hierarchical. We don't really care about feedback that you give us. Hence, you're a part of a big machine with a hierarchy, and you're there, and you're like, do X, and it's like, well, actually, that's really bad for your goal, and it doesn't matter. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Mm. Oh, yeah. I mean, this is really an area I want to move towards. I mean, I think that maybe what you're kind of tapping into is like advocacy. It's also just like organizing change. I mean, we are all dealing with massively frightening power structures. There's, huge flips in power that have happened all around us right now. Um, I think maybe you've asked me like too big of a question for a single answer, and we need to have another talk about this. But, I do think that something that I have learned, and this is really kind of calling back to my days of working with nonprofits and kind of people in David and Goliath sort of situations, and teachers and people exercise extraordinary resilience and extraordinary bravery in terrible situations, and including situations where they really feel very justifiably that they don't have a lot of power. And I don't think propose that as a solution. Like, but I do think it's critical to understand it because, to me, having moved from working with teachers who get paid nothing to working all the time with engineers who sort of sneeze the amount that teachers get paid, it is really, and I know that's not true of everybody, I'm not, but like, it is really interesting and important to me to try to bring people's attention to the power they do have, and I think also like, you know, there's a way in which this stuff is so hard and we're not talking about it. Like, I mean, Hazel brought up trauma. Like, there's just this kind of massive black hole. I'll tell you all, because you're being so kind to me, I feel really safe here. But like, even just operating as a psychologist in this space, I feel like I have to stay on the good side of the event horizon to not get like sucked in to the black hole of everybody's trauma, because I am not a therapist out here, you know, but I deeply want to work on helping strategies and helping build like ways for people to advocate, because ultimately, like, we are in these collections of human beings together, and like all you can do is try to make the situation you're in right now a little better, you know, or leave it. Maybe that's your version of it, but I have seen just a lot of progress coming from, you know, I talked recently to a developer who told me, sorry, developers again, that's just my beat, you know, it's just like who I talk to. A developer who said, I I read your research about, it was about AI stuff, and really disagreed with how their group was rolling out AI, and felt incredibly like top down mandated to use it, and felt really like, the whole org was, gonna have their work degrade in quality, and that felt quite overwhelmed by the whole thing. And you know, kind of came to me in this coffee chat we had with like, how do I change my entire company? And I was like, it's not your job. Your job is, how do I change like tomorrow, and let's make one plan together where you talk to one manager, um and the one that you think is like the most ambiguous about AI, the one that you feel like is closest to you. And let's not focus on what you think should happen, actually, because another thing I find is people often think, I can't take action until I know what the solution is. And so I said, well, what if we shrink it down and make it really easy? What if you just say, I just want to describe a few of the problems a little bit with you, and try to open up, like, maybe we're scared of some of the same things together. So this person did this, and they followed up with me, and it turned out their manager was full of all of the same fears about, AI. Their manager then was kind of inspired to like organize, like use their power, which to do something that wasn't scary for them, which was like organize this kind of collective group conversation. And it spun off like what in psychology we call like a virtuous cycle. A lot of people are in the middle, and they're kind of going, this is why psychology is so interesting to me. I'm sorry, I'm really rambling, but like, we are, more often than we would want to believe, we're really susceptible to being changed by our environments. And that is how power operates. And a lot of the time, power is asking other people to believe that it exists. So yeah, I'm interested in kind of poking holes in that like paper wall.
Papers on any of these, most welcome, because I am actually trying to research power. As in, I'm trying to understand it
Yeah.
rather than try to do influence. There's so much written about influence, and that's cool, but it's more like understand it so that you can develop strategies that make sense. Anyway, Hazel, your hand is up, and maybe with that, we're gonna finish it off.
So one thing that I was thinking of when Cal was talking, and then I have a question after that. But one thing I was thinking of was when I've had to deal with this type of thing, in my own career, in my own everything else, and the actual advice that I've had to give to people is, and the way I've come to understand it, is leaders have like these different sets of levers, and they tend to think of things in terms of levers and trade-offs because they're dealing with a complex system. And you have a lever, of influence and of alignment, of direction, optimization, and trade-offs, roughly. And, resource optimization, what are you optimizing? And pretty much every industry, pretty much every shape of how this works and how you scale the coordination of human activity is fairly well understood because it's been around for a few thousand years. And even if it hasn't been around for a few thousand years, it's directly, you can pull from something else, you can imitate it, and then you can iterate off of it. Knowledge work as a source of revenue for a company where it's the main source of revenue, and specifically knowledge work where the output is not a scarce resource is fundamentally fucking weird. We just haven't done that before. Like the printing press was the closest thing we ever got. And before this. And that was still, you had to buy the book. You had to buy the book, you had paper, you had the whole supply chain of it. And now you can just, select all, copy and paste, send it to millions of people in a second. Like, so we're still figuring that out. But then in terms of, like Kat said, sometimes things aren't your job. One thing that I was at SRACon, David Woods coined the term resilience engineering and does a lot of research in the area. And he and I were talking about this. And he mentioned one thing that people, particularly resilience and SREs and other infrastructure people need to understand. You are in the trenches. You're, always underground, you're always underwater, and you are by definition going to be that way. Because in a complex adaptive system, the system has different ways of adapting and stretching. And that transition period is a little rough and painful. When the system is a mechanical component, you have parts that are designed to wear down faster than others, like the clutch in an engine, in a car. The clutch wears out so that you don't screw up the gears. The clutch is the sacrificial part. In a socio-technical complex adaptive system, you, the infrastructure engineer, are inherently the clutch of the system. You are the thing that wears out first. And you have to be, because that's how it works. And you can do it in a good way, where you don't focus on burning the crap out of an individual person. And you don't, ruin the person, you don't traumatize them, but you replace the oil in the car, you do all these maintenance things, and then the car continues to function. Or you can just drive it in the second gear for your entire life, completely destroy the transmission, never change the oil, and blow up the engine in 10,000 miles. But we don't know what the levers are for dealing with humans when they're in that weird clutch spot. Because usually you can see it. You can see that trauma. But you can't really see it in this type of system because the work is invisible. And the reason the work is invisible is because you get so good at it so quickly that it's fluid, it looks like it's not hurting you and it's all inside. You do not come to work with a broken arm because you have to work a 90-hour week. You just come to work and you say, man, I'm tired. And so I don't think we have good tools for that yet. We need them. But I think in many ways we're still trying to understand how immature as a field we are. Sorry for the mini talk inside talk. The real question. So Kat, I know you've talked about how the idea of researching or talking about or figuring out how to hire software engineers or how to evaluate knowledge workers is something you have very much avoided. Lots of good reasons for that. It's a, capital H hard topic. But some of the things that you talked about in your talk really got me thinking. Do you think that it might be possible to have, potential questions or indicators that software people can ask themselves or in interviews or whatever to determine if companies are well supported?
Oh, I love that. That'd be really cool. Kind of the reverse hiring exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I would work on. So Hazel, I
Yeah.
live in holy terror of being consigned to doing HR for the rest of my life. Which is like
Mm-hmm.
that. So just to like let you know that that's what I'm afraid of. And as a psychologist, and yeah, so that's one reason I avoid some of those sort of areas, even though I actually am very interested in like how do we design
Mm-hmm.
tasks that feel like interesting and cool, maybe even like constructive. I mean, there's a lot of this in teaching and education. There's a lot of like, could we do a dynamic test that doesn't, hurt a learner, but is really a tutoring exercise? I love the reversal question. You really planted a little seed for me there, Hazel. Yeah, I think that I feel that that would be possible. And maybe even just like the difference between not having anything there and the difference between having like a little bit of an approximation of a signal of some of these things. One thing that I think is true is like knowledge workers do not value the forms of um they don't value some of the things they have enough, and they kind of take some of them for granted, and I count myself in this. Like, and I've thought about this when I used to have a really strong scientific community in psychology, and like how rich and important that was to like my success. You know, you can sort of say I want to be have a community practice, but you might not really like realize that's your culture, and then you kind of get like shifted out of it, you know, and that can be good or bad. But I do I'm really curious, how do developers make this legible to orgs? How do they say, listen, you don't really understand. I can connect you to not just to me, but to this incredible world of problem solving that I live inside of. And I know there's a gatekeeping version of this, you know, where like we're sort of have in groups and out groups. I'm not trying to speak to that, but like it is something that I think the industry needs to realize that it, you know, really benefits from, right? And I know I'm preaching to the choir because you live with things like open source, you know, and all of this work, but those sort of worlds in
Well,
which
open source,
happening is like,
yeah.
you know, orgs are really profiting off of those worlds of problem solving, as you all know.
Mhm. Yeah. Open source in particular is actually such a good example of developers not realizing the value that they have. Because one of the things in the zero interest rate economy happened is companies would go out of the way to find open source, organizations or software or foundations, throw money at them because it seems like a good idea. And then that became, that the money stopped being free. And so overnight, it just dried up everywhere. And all of a sudden, all these foundations had to go, oh, we've spent 10 years just not caring about what it means to deliver value to a community. Everybody in the room says we're valuable. We all agree that this is valuable. No one's ever written it down. No one can explain it. And no one can tell it to anyone else in an obvious way. So I think the community practice thing is one of those things where we need to start realizing immediately that we have that as a valuable thing, or we are going to lose it. Also, Brian, you've had your hand up for ages. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to say one other thing, which is as we're listening to all of this, and we talked about power structures, and recently I was involved in doing some stuff with I'm doing some stuff with Blue Sky and the AT protocol, and I've been thinking about what barriers we put in front of people to get things done, and I was really stuck on somebody saying something how it's valuable to do the hard thing. And I'm like, why are we trying to ask people to do hard things? We know who humans are, and the way we get people to do things is we make the hard things easy. Um, and so I have this new definition that I've been playing with for what a system is, and it is the laws, norms, incentives, and consequences that determine what is easy and what is hard. Because I think that ultimately, one of the things, as somebody was saying, you're talking about individuals. Ultimately, I think the behavior of individuals is very much driven by the environments that they're in, which are created by the systems that act upon them. And so, if we create systems and environments that make it silly to do, like make it so ridiculous to not do the right thing or the thing that we want them to do because it's so easy, and you get a lot of positive reinforcement for doing it, then we create environments where people will do the thing that we thought was hard because we made it easy. And that doesn't mean it's not complicated or complex. It just means there aren't a bunch of barriers that are thrown up in front of being able to get it done.
I like that. You know, I think it's a very productive question to ask. Why did someone leave? Why did someone exit? You know, well, I just did a study, it's not out yet, but we did this study about learners and people who are, you know, experienced technologists in various roles, um, and who are actually activated to be learners. Like they're taking the time. We all know learning is hard, but like they're taking the time to act. They've opted in. They have a goal. They've signed up for a course in whatever, cybersecurity or something, you know, like, and they're doing it. And then it becomes a really interesting question. why did they leave? You know, some of them stay and some of them leave. And I find a lot of the time people do not get to that point. There's like so much in tech that's about upping our engagement numbers and so little that's about truly understanding retention. But yeah, I do have to hop off probably, but I've deeply enjoyed this. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And with that, I just want to wrap it up. The recording will be up soon. I look forward to the links so that we can put it all together. See you the next time. Good
Take care,
day,
everyone.
afternoon, whatever. Bye-bye.